Welcome. My name is Paolo Annino. I'm a professor at Florida State University College of Law, and I'm talking today about special education. This is part 2 of a 6-part series, and thank you for coming along with me for part 2. Part 2, we're going to talk about evaluations. In part 1, we learned the main concept for the Individuals with Disability Education Act. And that main concept is a free and appropriate public education. That is the goal for the Individuals with Disability Education Act, is a free and appropriate public education. Now, what we're going to learn today is how to obtain a free and appropriate public education for our foster children. So we're going to talk about the main way, and that is evaluations. Evaluations. I remember many years ago I gave a talk to the American Bar Association on this topic, and for some strange reason in my younger days I stood on a chair and I yelled out, evaluations, 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 like it was the French Revolution. But ultimately the main point is this evaluations is how we achieve a free and appropriate public education. It is the key element. It is what parents who go, or non-attorneys or non-advocates who go to individual education plan meetings, why they fail. Why do they fail? Usually it's because of the failure to have the appropriate evaluations. There are many types of evaluations, but it is through evaluations we determine a number of factors. The most important being this. It is through evaluations we determine the unique needs of the child. And as advocates in the Guardian ad litem system, we are handicapped. We're not the parents of the child. We're not staying with this child day in, day out. So we definitely need experts to tell us what the unique needs of the child are. That doesn't mean that we can't use common sense and, based on our interactions with the child, also give input on what the unique needs are. But ultimately, it is these scientific, evidence-based conclusions that we're going to rely on to create a free and appropriate public education for the particular child. Now, again, unique needs. This is not class action. This is not systemic. This is one particular child trying to get the unique needs to provide that unique child a free and appropriate public education. There's no cookie cutter process here. So again, how do we do it? Is through evaluations. And we use evaluations for a variety of purposes. One is, the most important, is to determine the unique needs of the child. The other purpose of evaluations is to determine the eligibility. Is the child even eligible for special education? What you're going to find in your interactions with your children, that most of the children that you encounter in the foster care system are already in the special education system. But there are some students and some children that fell through the cracks. They have not been identified as needing special education. So how do we make those children eligible? Well, the first step, as we're going to talk about, is by getting an evaluation. What else do we use evaluations for? In addition to eligibility, in addition to determining unique needs, in the next part, we're going to talk about the individual education plan document. And one element of that document is called the present level of performance. And that tells us where the child presently is educationally, the present status of the child educationally, both academically and behaviorally and socially. Again, how do we determine that? Through evaluations. So evaluations are key to this whole process. Now, let me talk about a variety of evaluations. Now, how many kind of evaluations are there? There are innumerable kind of evaluations. There's speech therapy evaluation. There's occupational therapy. Occupational therapy is fine motor skills, buttons, holding a pencil. Physical therapy evaluations. There's aptitude, intellectual ability evaluations. There's achievement, academic achievement evaluations. Where is the child presently in his or her grade level? So there are many different types of evaluations. Let me just talk about two very common type that you're going to encounter. This type, the first one is, I want to call it the aptitude test. Aptitude test or aptitude evaluations. We usually call those IQ tests. This test tells us what is the child's innate ability, what is the child's innate talent. So this test does not tell us how hard the child worked, does not tell us all the child achieved. It only tells us innate ability. And there's two major aptitude tests that are used in this country. The first one is called the Stanford-Binet, B-I-N-E-T. And the next one test that's used is called the Wechsler test. So Stanford-Binet and the Wechsler test are both very common aptitude tests that routinely is used for children and adults in this country. And that tells us aptitude, tells us innate ability. Why is that important? Well, you want to know if the child has the innate ability to do certain work. So one test is aptitude. Another test that you're going to encounter, evaluation test, is called achievement test. And there are many different types of achievement tests. What achievement test is, it doesn't measure aptitude, does not measure innate intellectual ability or talent. What it measures is how hard did you work? How many late nights have you put into it? I mean, I remember in my college days, I was thinking of becoming a math major. That was a mistake, but that was another story. And I remember taking my college calculus class, and I was working all times of night to get my B in that class, where my other colleagues, students in the class who were math majors, were spending half or quarter of the time. So again, there's achievement, which just depends on how hard you work, and then there's aptitude. And we want to know both. We want to know aptitude and we want to know achievement. I'm very much interested in knowing what grade level is the child before me. I want to know, if the child is in the fourth grade, what grade level is this child reading in? Is she reading in the fourth grade level, or is she reading in the first grade level? I want to know what grade level is the child in math. Is the child, if the child's in ninth grade, what level of math is she doing? Is she doing second grade math, or is she doing ninth grade math? So grade level for me is very important to know. And we get the grade level from a test called the achievement test. And there's a number of achievement tests out there, but the primary achievement test is the Woodcock-Johnson. I see that very often. That's a very common achievement test, which compares the child to other children at that same grade level. Okay, so we were just talking about aptitude and achievement tests. And I want to talk about three more aspects, at least, of evaluations. First, I want to talk about the common problems that you're going to encounter dealing with evaluations. There are a number. Often, what happens is there simply is no evaluation. You're ready to go to an individual education plan meeting, the forum to resolve these issues, and the child has not been evaluated by the school. So that is one of the very common, you believe the child has a speech impediment, or you believe the child has some physical impediment, or some cognitive impediment, but there's been no recent evaluation. So one of the problems is simply there's no evaluation. Another problem you're going to encounter is that there is evaluation, but it's totally inadequate. They skipped, for example, the aptitude test, or they skipped the achievement test, or the evaluation really has no tests at all. What it has is simply the teacher's observations of the child. So that's another very common problem. So either no evaluation or an inadequate evaluation. A third problem is you'll find this 50-page Dr. Freud type evaluation, very detailed, but you get to the recommendation section and it simply says, I defer to the IEP meeting. So it gives no recommendations. So again, you're not getting any help from the expert on how to create a free and appropriate public education. So there's often these problems here. What I suggest is, number one is, this is very typical, that there is no evaluation or the evaluation is inadequate. My suggestion is to notify the school that you're requesting a new evaluation on the child to address these issues. I do not recommend, again, I do not recommend going to an individual education plan meeting without a new evaluation if one doesn't exist or one's inadequate. Now, some school districts will require you to go to the IEP to make the request at the IEP itself, individual education plan meeting itself. So yes, you should go for that one limited purpose, and that limited purpose is just to get the individual education plan team on board to make that request for the evaluation. So that's very important that you have an evaluation that you can actually use in these matters. As I mentioned, or I meant to mention before, was for the first evaluation after eligibility, it has to be done within 60 days. So the first evaluation for eligibility within 60 days. But then the question is, okay, what about for reevaluations? Are there any reevaluations required? The answer is yes, sort of. Every 3 years, there is to be a full reevaluation of the child. Why is that? Children change. And within a 3-year period, there could be cognitive changes, behavioral changes, physical changes. Kids are growing, and so there could be changes. So every 3 years, you have a right to a full evaluation. However, in 2004, Congress gave school districts the option to approach the parent to waive the 3-year evaluation, So many times now, what you're going to see on the IEP document, individual education plan document, you're going to see a box, and they're going to ask the parent to waive the 3-year evaluation. Again, I recommend that you never waive a 3-year evaluation. Why? Because, again, evaluations, that's how you create a free and appropriate public education. And if you don't know how the child's progressing, then how are you going to determine the unique needs and determine the services this child needs now, not what he needed 3 years ago, but needs right now. So it's important not to waive the 3-year evaluation. One other comment I want to make about evaluations, and this comes up often, is sources of evaluation. Well, there are innumerable sources of evaluations, many sources. First is the school itself. The school is required to do the initial evaluation, and they're required, if not waived, to do reevaluations. So the school itself is required to do reevaluations. And I want to stress too, you don't have to wait 3 years for a reevaluation. You can approach a school and say, look, there's been drastic changes here. I think we need a new reevaluation. The question is, what time frame does a school have to do reevaluations? Regretfully, the law is not clear on that topic. Generally, the cases say reasonable. So unlike the initial evaluation where it's a nice clean number 60 days after the consent, there is no nice clean number when it comes to reevaluations for the school. But there are other sources of evaluations, and in this aspect, probably one of the few aspects, foster children are fortunate. Department of Children and Family Services does a number of evaluations on children in the foster care system. Psychological evaluations, behavioral evaluations, all those evaluations can be used. Community-based agencies, they do a number of evaluations on this population, and those can be used. Many of these children, because they're disabled, are also qualified for a federal program, a Social Security program called Supplemental Security Income, SSI. And in order to receive SSI, you have to be evaluated. So again, that's another source of evaluations is through the Social Security process. And then some of our children, again, talking earlier about the frustrations and stressors of being a foster child, the innumerable stressors they have, some of our children get involved with the criminal justice system, juvenile justice system. And it's very common for these children, then, for the public defenders especially, to move for competency evaluations when they do get involved in our juvenile delinquency system. Again, that's another source of evaluations. So you can use all these different sources of evaluation to determine the unique needs of the child. And you can present these, as we talked about in the next part, to our individual education plan meeting where you can argue for a free and appropriate public education. And again, the last point I want to get across, as I mentioned before, ultimately, everything here depends on the advocate doing the ask. And that ask is going to depend on the evaluations. So the advocate will know the unique needs and what services to ask for. But there's another source of evaluation, which it's important for me to mention. And an advocate or guardian for the child can request an independent educational evaluation. An independent educational evaluation. Independent educational evaluation. And what that is simply this, that the advocate says, I read your evaluation, school district, and it's inadequate. Therefore, because your evaluation is inadequate, I'm going to spend my own money and obtain an independent educational evaluation. And then I'm going to send you the bill. And you're going to be required to pay for it. So the federal law authorizes this process called independent educational evaluation. My suggestion is if you are going to go this route, is that you send a letter to the school district notifying them ahead of time that you find their evaluation inadequate, and then do your own evaluation, and then send the bill to the school district. And then the school district, if they object, and their objection is that they're going to claim that their evaluation, the school district evaluation, is adequate, then the burden is on the school district to go to an administrative hearing in front of the Department of Administrative Hearing, DOA, go to administrative hearing on the issue of independent educational evaluation, on the issue of whether or not the school district's evaluation is adequate or not. So again, just to summarize, there is another way of obtaining a evaluation, and that is called independent educational evaluation. But you can only obtain that is if you claim and you have evidence of and you can justify that the school district's evaluation is inadequate. And then the burden will be on the school district to take you to a hearing on the issue of who pays for the evaluation that you just paid for. I want to step back. One of the things I wanted to bring across right up front is when I get a case, special education case, the first things I ask for are the last individual education plan and the last evaluation. So the last individual education plan and the last evaluation. There is a process here where evaluations have to be done initially. So before you become eligible for special education, there has to be an evaluation. Let me spend a minute talking about eligibility for those cases. There's not too often, but sometimes children do fall in the cracks and are not identified as requiring special education. The first step is under IDEA. IDEA has a 10-category approach. What that means is there's 10 separate categories of disabilities, like autism, mobility impairment, vision impairment. There's 10 categories. And the last category is other health impairment. It's a catch-all category. So your AIDS child, your HIV child, your Tourette syndrome child are all under that other health impairment. So the child has to fit into one of the 10 categories to become eligible. And how do you know the child fits into one of those 10 categories? Evaluations, evaluations, evaluations. There is some laws dealing with the time frame of the evaluation. So for the initial evaluation, it has to be done within 60 days. Again, within 60 days of the parent or the guardian advocate signing the consent form. So no evaluation occurs until the consent form is signed to the school district that the child is to be evaluated. So 60 days thereafter, there will be an evaluation, and that evaluation will tell us whether or not the child fits into one of the 10 categories. And then the next step, because it's a two-pronged test for eligibility, the next step for eligibility for IDEA is the disability has to have an adverse impact on the child's education. It has to adversely affect the child's education. So let me give you an example. Say you have a child that's in a wheelchair kid, and the child's getting all A's. Does that child meet the requirements of IDEA eligibility? And the answer is no, because under IDEA, it's a two-pronged test. You have to meet one of the 10 categories. He does, or she does. It's the category of mobility impairment. But the second part of the test is the disability has to adverse affect the child's education. And in the hypothetical I just gave, the child was getting all A's, and that's an indication that it's not adversely affecting his education. We'll talk in the part 6, we'll talk about the alternative education law called the Rehabilitation Act that applies to children that do not, disabled children, that do not fit under IDEA. So if a child does not fit under IDEA, it's not like there's no hope out there. There is protections, and that is the Rehabilitation Act. And we'll talk about that in part 6. So next thing I wish to talk about is typical problems. What are the typical problems with evaluations? Well, first thing, if you're not a clinical psychologist, and I'm certainly not, they're hard to read. These evaluations are very difficult to read. And some evaluators make it even more difficult by using all types of jargon, by using a lot of statistical analysis, and they simply make it very difficult to read. Well, that's our job. I think we need to just roll up our sleeves, or we're a Commonwealth nation, pull up our socks, and we just have to immerse ourselves in the evaluation and understand it. So my suggestion is to use Google to try to understand it, talk to the psychologist or the physical therapist who created it to try to understand it. But you need to understand the evaluation. It is no good. It is a waste of everyone's time if you're going to try to be an advocate if you don't understand the evaluation. You need to understand the evaluation. And that takes time. That takes telephone calls and talking to different experts to try to understand the evaluation. Because it's going to be up to you to create a free and appropriate public education for this child. And you're going to do that by creating the unique needs, but also determining what type of services the child with these unique needs is to receive by the school district to get and receive a free and appropriate public education. So based on unique needs, we determine services, and based on the services, we create a free and appropriate public education. So as to this section, the main point again is evaluations, evaluations, evaluations. In the next section, we're going to talk about the individual education plan itself and the different components of the individual education plan. And one key component of that plan is called present level of performance. Present level of performance. And that present level of performance is going to be based on the evaluation. And for example, a present level of performance should tell me in layperson language where is the child right now. It should be so clear that you can talk to a camp counselor and talk to that camp counselor about the child's present level of performance. What grade level is the child reading in? What math level is the child reading in? What is the child's social behavior? Again, that will all depend on the evaluations. So thank you. And so the next part we'll be talking about the individual education plan itself and the distinct components of that plan.